The locals didn't warn them. That was the first sign, though Elias wouldn't recognize it until much later. In the horror movies Mike loved to quote, there was always a harbinger, a toothless gas station attendant or a cryptic old woman warning the city folk to turn back, for the moon rises. But in dragging the three of them to the darker folds of the Nantahala National Forest, there was only indifference. The man at the bait shop where they bought their permits didn't look up from his ledger. The waitress at the diner in Bryson City just topped off their coffee and stared through them, as if they were already ghosts, or perhaps simply irrelevant specks against the backdrop of the ancient hills. "It's better this way," Elias said, adjusting the straps of his Osprey pack as they stood at the trailhead. Real isolation. No tourists. No glamping sites. Just the Blue Ridge and us. "I still don't see why we couldn't do a cabin," Sarah muttered, tying her boots with aggressive knots. She was the skeptic, the one who preferred concrete under her feet and cell service in her pocket. "We could hike during the day and sleep somewhere with a locking door at night." A door seems like a reasonable request for a vacation. "Defeats the purpose," Mike chimed in, slamming the trunk of his Subaru. He was grinning, that wide, reckless grin that usually preceded bad decisions. "We're purging the corporate toxins, Sarah. We are returning to the primal self. No Wi-Fi. No emails, just vibes and bears. I'd like to keep my primal self warm and dry," Jen added, though she was smiling. Jen was the bridge, Elias's fiancée and Sarah's best friend. She was the only reason this trip was happening, the glue holding the disparate desires of the group together. They left the car at a gravel turnout that barely qualified as a trailhead. The map Elias held was a topographical mess of contour lines, marking a route that technically existed but hadn't been maintained since the Reagan administration. They were heading for a depression in the geography known as Blackwood Hollow. On the map, it looked like a thumbprint pressed deep into the green clay of the mountains, a place where the contour lines squeezed together so tightly they formed a solid black bruise. The hike-in was deceptive. The Appalachian afternoon was golden, the sunlight filtering through the canopy in cathedral beams. The air smelled of pine needles and damp earth, that rich, rot-sweet scent of life decomposing to feed new life. For the first 3 hours, the mood was high. Mike cracked jokes about hillbillies, Elias pointed out flora, identifying Galax and Trillium, and Sarah actually stopped checking her phone, mostly because the signal had died 2 miles back. But as the sun began to dip, painting the sky in bruises of purple and orange, the geography changed. They crossed a ridge line, stepping over a fallen chestnut log that was thick with moss. It felt like crossing a threshold. On the other side, the air was stiller. Heavier. The chatter of the birds, which had been a constant companion, ceased abruptly. "Quiet," Sarah whispered, stopping on the trail. "Yeah, peaceful," Mike said, panting slightly. "No," Sarah said, shivering despite the humidity. "Not peaceful. Quiet. Like a room when an argument just stopped." Elias checked his compass. The needle swung lazily, drifting rather than pointing. "Iron deposits," he muttered, tapping the glass, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "Common in these parts. We just follow the ridge down into the valley. The hollow is at the bottom." The descent was steep. The trees here were different, older, twisted into arthritic shapes. Giant hemlocks and oaks that had likely stood since before the country was a country blocked the sky. The undergrowth grew dense, the rhododendron hells, forming tangled walls of woody limbs that seemed to reach for their ankles. By the time they reached the flat ground of Blackwood Hollow, twilight had turned to dusk. The light here was gray and watery. The hollow was a bowl, trapping the cold air and the silence. Camp here, Mike suggested, dropping his pack with a thud near a flat clearing by a slow-moving creek. Ground looks good, Elias agreed. Let's get tents up before we lose the light completely. They worked in a rhythm born of long friendship, but the silence of the hollow pressed against them. Usually, setting up camp was loud, clattering poles, laughter, the zip of nylon. Here, they found themselves moving softly, speaking in hushed tones, as if afraid to wake something sleeping in the heavy loam beneath their feet. Jen was driving a stake into the ground when she stopped, the mallet poised in midair. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" Elias asked, pausing with a handful of kindling. "Music," Jen said, frowning. "Like wind chimes, but deep. Bone on wood." They all froze, straining their ears against the silence. The creek gurgled, a wet, dark sound. The wind moved high in the canopy, a distant ocean roar. "I don't hear anything," Mike said, though he looked toward the dark wall of trees uneasily. "Just the wind in the branches," Elias reassured her, though he felt a prickle of unease at the base of his neck. "Sound travels weird in a bowl like this." Jen nodded, slowly returning to her work. "Yeah, just the wind." But later, after the fire was lit and the darkness had solidified into a physical weight around their small circle of light, Elias saw her looking out into the blackness, her head cocked, listening to a melody only she could hear. Morning brought a thick, clinging fog. It wasn't the ethereal mist of postcards. It was a gray, wet blanket that tasted of copper and wet fur. Elias woke first. The fire was a heap of cold white ash. He unzipped the tent, the sound shockingly loud, and crawled out. The visibility was less than 20 feet. The trees were merely silhouettes, hulking giants watching the campsite. He walked to the edge of the clearing to relieve himself. As he zipped up, he looked into the gray void. "Elias." He spun around. The voice was Jen's. It came from the trees to his left, about 30 yards out. "Jen," he called back, confused. "What are you doing out there?" "Elias." The tone was flat, not urgent, not inquisitive. Just his name, spoken with the exact same inflection as the first time. A recording played twice. "Jen, stop screwing around. It's freezing," he said, stepping toward the tree line. "Elias." It was closer now. But something was wrong. The pitch was Jen's, but the resonance was off. It sounded wet, bubbling, as if the throat speaking it was filled with liquid. "Elias." He jumped, spinning back toward the tents. Jen was standing by the fire pit, rubbing sleep from her eyes. She was wearing her bright yellow parka. The voice in the woods had come from the opposite direction. Elias looked back at the wall of fog. I thought you were over there." Jen looked at him, concern knitting her brow. "I just woke up. I haven't left the tent." Elias stared into the mist. The silence of the woods felt expectant. "I heard you calling me." "Must have been a dream, man," Mike said, emerging from his tent, stretching until his back popped. "Or an echo. Acoustics here are trippy." Elias nodded slowly, but he didn't believe it. "Yeah, must be." They decided to hike deeper into the hollow to find a waterfall marked on the map. The fog refused to lift. It clung to them, dampening their clothes and their spirits. The forest floor was soft, spongy with layers of decaying needles. They found no animal tracks. No deer scat. No squirrel scratchings. Just undisturbed rot. About an hour in, Sarah stopped. She pointed at a tree. A massive American chestnut, dead but standing, bleached white like a bone. "Look at the bark," she whispered. About 7 feet up the trunk, The bark had been stripped away. Into the wood, deep gouges had been carved. They weren't random claw marks. They were deliberate. They were teeth marks. Bear? Mike asked, his voice lacking its usual bravado. Elias ran his hand near the marks but didn't touch them. The saliva dried on the wood looked black and oily. Too high for a black bear. And the pattern? Bears bite to mark territory or strip bark for sap. This looks like something was gnawing. Like a dog on a bone. A 7-foot-tall dog? Jen asked, wrapping her arms around herself. Let's keep moving, Elias said, turning away from the tree. We need to make the waterfall and loop back before dark. They walked for another hour, but the terrain began to feel repetitive. The same clusters of ferns, the same twisted roots. Elias checked the compass. It was spinning slowly, a lazy clockwise rotation that made no sense. The GPS is dead, Mike said, tapping his Garmin watch. Satellites can't punch through the canopy and the fog, I guess. We're following the creek, Elias said. It leads to the falls. We can't be lost. But the creek was changing. The water, clear yesterday, was turning turbid, a dark, bruised brownish black. And the sound of it had changed. It no longer sounded like water over rocks. It sounded like murmuring. Sarah stopped abruptly. Shish. What? Mike whispered. Listen. They stood frozen. From the ridge above them, hidden by the fog, came a sound. We are returning to the primal self. It was Mike's voice. Perfect in cadence, perfect in pitch. But it was booming, as if amplified by the trees themselves. Mike turned pale. That's me. That's what I said yesterday. I'd like to keep my primal self warm and dry. Jen's voice answered from a different direction, down inside a ravine to their right. Defeats the purpose, Mike's voice replied, this time coming from behind them. It wasn't an echo. It was a conversation being reenacted, disjointed and thrown around the forest like a ventriloquist practicing a routine. Run, Elias whispered. What? Sarah breathed. Run. Elias screamed. The forest erupted. It wasn't a visual explosion, but an auditory one. Leaves rustled violently as if 100 invisible bodies were sprinting toward them. Branches snapped with the sound of gunshots. They bolted. Panic, hot and primal, seized them. They didn't follow the trail. They just ran away from the voices. They tore through the rhododendrons, the branches whipping their faces, tearing at their clothes like grasping fingers. Elias was in the lead, his lungs burning. He could hear Jen behind him, gasping. He risked a glance back. The fog seemed to be moving with them, swirling into shapes that almost looked like limbs. Long, spindly gray limbs that dissolved when looked at directly. They crashed into a clearing and Elias skidded to a halt, nearly colliding with a structure. It wasn't their camp. It was a cabin, or the rot of one. The roof had collapsed in the center, making it look like a crushed skull. The logs were black with age and slick with moss. There was no door, just a gaping maw of darkness. Where are we? Jen sobbed, bending over, hands on her knees. I don't know, Elias said, spinning around, knife in hand. Where are Mike and Sarah? Jen looked up, eyes wide. They were right behind me. The woods were silent again. The murmuring creek, the mimicry voices, the crashing footsteps, all gone. Mike, Sarah, Elias screamed. His voice didn't echo. The trees swallowed the sound instantly. Then, from inside the ruined cabin, a voice spoke. Quiet, like a room when an argument just stopped. It was Sarah's voice. It was coming from the chimney. Elias moved toward the cabin. Jen grabbed his arm. "Don't," she hissed. "That's not her. We don't know that," Elias whispered, though in his gut, he knew. He shook her off and stepped onto the rotting porch. The wood groaned under his weight, a sound like snapping tendons. He clicked on his flashlight, cutting a beam into the gloom of the interior. The air inside was colder than outside, smelling of copper and musk. The floor was covered in debris, leaves, trash, and bones. Thousands of them. Small bones. Birds, squirrels, raccoons. They were piled in the corners, arranged in intricate spirals. Hanging from the rafters were mobiles made of vertebrae threaded on gut. "Sarah," Elias whispered. The fireplace was blocked by a collapse of stones, but there was a hole, a dark gap leading up into the chimney breast. "Elias." This time, it was Sarah's real voice. Small, terrified, and very quiet. "I'm here," Elias said, approaching the fireplace. "Where are you?" "I fell," the voice said. "I was running and the ground. It opened up. I'm down here. It's tight. I can't move my arms." Elias frowned. The voice was coming from the chimney, but she said she was down. He shone the light into the gap in the stones. It didn't go up. It went down. A hole had been smashed through the hearthstone, leading into a dark sub-basement or a natural fissure beneath the cabin. "Jen, get the rope from my pack," Elias ordered. He leaned closer to the hole. "Is Mike with you?" A pause. A long, heavy silence. "Mike is asleep." The way she said it made the hair on Elias's arms stand up. The word, asleep, sounded heavy, loaded with a wrongness. Jen returned with the rope. Her hands were shaking so badly she dropped it twice. Elias tied a bowline knot around his waist and handed the other end to Jen. "Anchor it to that beam on the porch. If I yell, you pull." "Elias, please," Jen begged. "This feels like a trap. Sarah is down there." Elias lowered himself into the hole. It was tight, the stones scraping his shoulders. The smell was overpowering now. Rotting meat and stale earth. He dropped about 10 feet and his boots hit soft dirt. He swung the light around. He was in a root cellar, or a cave that the cabin had been built atop. Roots from the trees above dangled through the ceiling like hanged men's legs. Sarah. She was huddled in the corner, her knees pulled to her chest. She was rocking back and forth. Elias rushed to her. "Sarah. Hey, I got you." She looked up. Her eyes were wide, pupils blown so large her eyes were entirely black. She was shivering violently. "Where's Mike?" Elias asked, scanning the small room. Sarah slowly raised a shaking hand and pointed toward the darker, back corner of the cellar where the roots were thickest. Elias swung the light. Mike was there. He was standing up, facing the dirt wall. His arms were at his sides. "Mike," Elias called out. "We gotta go, man." Mike didn't move. Elias stepped closer. Mike turned around. Elias scrambled backward, tripping over his own feet. It was Mike's clothes. It was Mike's hair. But the face. The face was smooth, featureless. Just an expanse of pale, wet skin where eyes, nose, and mouth should be. Then, the skin where the mouth should have been split open. It didn't part like lips, it tore like wet paper. "We are purging the corporate toxins, Sarah," the thing said, using Mike's voice perfectly. Elias grabbed Sarah by the jacket. "Up, now." He hauled her toward the rope. The Mike thing didn't run. It didn't have to. The roots hanging from the ceiling suddenly animated, writhing like snakes. They lashed out, wrapping around Elias's ankle. He screamed, slashing at them with his knife. The wood bled red sap when he cut it. He shoved Sarah toward the hole. Climb. Jen was pulling from above. Sarah scrambled up, her boots finding purchase on the stone. Elias kicked free of the root, losing his boot in the process. He jumped, grabbing the edge of the hearthstone. From the darkness below, the mic thing shrieked. It wasn't a human sound. It was the sound of a fox screaming, multiplied by 10, mixed with the grinding of stones. Elias hauled himself up, rolling onto the cabin floor. Run, Jen, run. They sprinted out of the cabin, into the darkening woods. The sun was setting. Night was coming, and with it, the true owners of the hollow. They didn't know where they were running, only that they had to keep moving. The forest had changed again. The trees weren't just watching anymore. They were shepherding. Every time Elias tried to veer uphill, toward where the ridge should be, a tangle of briars would appear that hadn't been there a moment before, or a sudden drop-off would force them back down into the gut of the hollow. They were being herded. They collapsed near a rocky overhang, exhausted. Sarah was catatonic, staring at her hands. Jen was weeping silently. Elias was trying to construct a weapon out of a sturdy branch and his knife, his mind racing. What was that? Jen whispered. What was that thing? It wasn't Mike, Elias said, his voice grim. The woods. They took him. Maybe last night. Maybe when we got separated in the fog. It had his voice, Sarah whispered. She spoke for the first time since the cabin. It creates. It takes what you are and it recycles it. How do you know? Elias asked. Because. Sarah looked up, tears cutting tracks through the dirt on her face. When I was down there, it told me. It whispered to me before you came down. It said it's been hungry for so long. It said Mike was spicy, loud. It likes the loud ones. The sun vanished. The darkness was absolute. The heavy cloud cover blocked the stars. They had one flashlight left, Elias's, and the batteries were dimming. Then, the drumming started. Boom, boom, boom. It was coming from the ground. A rhythmic thumping, like a massive heart beating beneath the soil. It's coming, Sarah said. We need fire, Elias said. Animals hate fire. That wasn't an animal, Elias. Jen snapped. It's flesh and blood. If it bleeds, it burns. He gathered dry leaves frantically, striking his flint. A small flame sputtered to life. He fed it twigs, then larger branches. The light pushed back the dark a few feet. As the fire grew, they saw them. At the edge of the light, just beyond the ring of illumination, were figures. They looked like people. They stood upright. But their proportions were wrong. Arms too long, knees bending backward, necks elongated. They stood perfectly still, melding with the tree trunks. There's so many, Jen whimpered. Don't look at them, Elias commanded. Look at the fire. Don't look at them, a voice called from the darkness. It was Elias's voice. Look at the fire, another voice mimicked. Then, a chorus of voices began. A cacophony of their own conversations from the last 2 days, layered over one another, distorted, looping. Real isolation. Did you hear that? Just the wind. Better this way. The figures stepped closer. The firelight caught their skin. It wasn't skin. It was bark, and moss, and wet leaves matted together into the shape of flesh. They were the forest trying to be human. One of them stepped fully into the light. It wore a tattered, red flannel shirt. Mike's shirt. The Mike thing smiled, that horrific, split-face smile. It raised a hand. In it, it held Mike's GPS watch. Satellites can't punch through, it gurgled. It threw the watch. It landed in the fire, the plastic melting instantly, sending up a plume of black, toxic smoke. They want the fire out, Elias realized. They aren't afraid of it. They just don't like the light. The creatures rushed. It wasn't a coordinated attack. It was a wave of biomass crashing into them. Elias swung his makeshift spear, impaling the mic thing. It didn't scream. It just pushed itself further up the spear, snapping its jaws at Elias's face. Jen screamed as something grabbed her hair. A creature made of vines and deer bones was dragging her backward into the dark. Jen! Elias roared. He kicked the mic thing away, losing his weapon, and dove for Jen. He grabbed her wrist. The strength of the creature was immense. It felt like trying to pull a root out of the earth. "Let me go!" Jen screamed at the creature. She kicked wildly, her boot connecting with the thing's head. The skull, a deer skull, shattered. The vines went limp. Elias hauled her back to the fire. "Sarah, we have to move. The fire is dying." Sarah was standing in the middle of the chaos, perfectly still. "Sarah." She turned to look at him. "They just want to be us, Elias. They're lonely. The hills are so lonely." "Sarah, snap out of it." A massive hand, made of wet clay and stone, reached out of the darkness and grabbed Sarah by the waist. She didn't scream. She just looked at Elias, a sad, resigned expression on her face. "I'm going to stay. I'm going to teach them how to be quiet." "No." Elias lunged, but the darkness swallowed her instantly. There was a wet crunch, then silence from that direction. Elias and Jen were back to back, the fire down to embers. The circle of creatures was closing in. "We're going to die here," Jen whispered. Elias looked at the embers. Then he looked at the can of white gas for the camp stove attached to his pack. "Maybe," Elias said. "Run when I say run." "What?" Elias unhooked the fuel bottle. He unscrewed the cap. "Close your eyes." He sprayed the fuel over the embers and threw the bottle into the center. The explosion was deafening. A fireball rolled outward, a wave of heat and light that momentarily turned the hollow into high noon. The creatures shrieked, a collective sound of thousands of dry branches snapping at once. They recoiled, blinded and burning. "Run!" Elias grabbed Jen's hand. They sprinted, not away from the creatures, but through them, while they were disorganized. They ran blindly uphill, clawing at the earth, scrambling over rocks. Behind them, the forest burned. The fire had caught the dry hemlocks. The rhododendron hell became a literal hell of twisting flames. The heat chased them. The screams of the burning things chased them. Screams that sounded like Mike, like Sarah, like themselves. They ran until their legs gave out. They ran until the sun began to rise, a gray, sickly dawn that illuminated the smoke hanging in the valleys. They hit the asphalt of the old state road before they saw it. Jen collapsed on the yellow line, weeping uncontrollably. Elias stood, chest heaving, staring back at the tree line. The fire had died down, or the forest had simply swallowed it. The woods stood silent, dense, and green. A logging truck rumbled around the bend, air brakes hissing as the driver saw them. He leaned out the window, a heavy-set man with a beard. "Jesus, folks, you look like you went 10 rounds with a bear. You all right?" Elias looked at the driver. He wanted to speak, but his throat felt full of dirt. "We need police," Jen choked out. "Our friends. There. .. She couldn't finish. The driver nodded, face grave. "Climb in. I'll get you to the ranger station." As the truck pulled away, Elias watched the rearview mirror. At the edge of the woods, Just where the trees met the road, a figure was standing. It was wearing a blue windbreaker. Sarah's windbreaker. It raised a hand in a stiff, jerking wave. Elias turned away, facing the windshield. He closed his eyes, but he could still see the woods. He could feel the roots moving beneath the asphalt, sensing the vibration of the tires, tracking them. It has been 6 months. The search parties found nothing. No bodies. No tent. No cabin. They found the burnt patch of forest, but the rangers blamed it on a lightning strike. They said Mike and Sarah must have gotten lost and succumbed to the elements. Hypothermia. Falls. Bears. Jen moved back to Ohio. She lives in a high-rise apartment in downtown Columbus. She says she needs to be where there is only concrete and steel. She sleeps with a noise machine on the white noise setting. Never. Rainforest. Elias stayed. He rented a small house on the outskirts of Bryson City, overlooking the tree line. He sits on his porch at night, a shotgun across his lap, listening. He knows they aren't done. He knows the boundaries of the hollow are porous. Sometimes, when the wind is right, coming down off the mountain, he hears them. He hears Mike laughing. He hears Sarah humming. And lately, he's started hearing something new. Last night, he woke up to a tapping on his window. He looked out into the yard, where the forest begins. There was nothing there, just the trees. But then, from the darkness under his porch, a voice spoke. Elias. It's better this way. Real isolation. It was his own voice. Elias racked the shotgun. He didn't go outside. He knows the rules now. You don't answer. You don't look. And you never, ever let them know you're listening. Because the woods are old, and they are lonely, and they are always learning new voices. Thank you so much for watching this video. Make sure to subscribe, like, comment and turn on notifications if you enjoyed the video so you never miss an upload.